Good evening, and many thanks all for coming. It's great to look down the list of participants at this evening's session and see names of friends and family and colleagues, and indeed members of Clan Macpherson. So welcome all. Tonight I'm going to be talking about James Macpherson, but instead of focusing on the Macpherson of Ossian fame, we're going to be looking at Macpherson the historian. And this is the subject of a book I'm currently writing with Mary Macpherson, which we published by Edinburgh University Press around this time next year. Our argument is not only that we should pay attention to Macpherson's explicit history writings, but that across all his writings, both poetry and prose, Macpherson functions as an historian, and that he writes about the past in a mode of Enlightenment history writing that can be usefully compared to more well-known 18th century historians such as David Hume, Edward Gibbon, Hugh Blair, and others. We don't claim that Macpherson is in some way a pioneer of Enlightenment history writing, or that he does it better than Hume or Gibbon or whoever. Instead, we argue that it is important to take his history writing seriously and to recognise Macpherson's contribution to this broader intellectual movement. This in turn helps us to better understand the contribution of Highlanders to the Enlightenment, and that Macpherson should take his place alongside the likes of Adam Ferguson and the Highland ministers that Donald Meek so persuasively writes about as an Enlightenment intellectual. So in tonight's talk, I'll first briefly introduce you to James Macpherson, for those not already acquainted with him. Then we'll outline some of the key concepts and features of Enlightenment history writing, so that we can then measure how Macpherson also writes about the past in this mode. We'll look at a couple of examples of Macpherson's history writing from his earlier Celtic stuff to the later works on empire. And then we'll conclude by thinking about what these writings tell us about Macpherson's relationship with colonialism, and how we can usefully read these texts, Macpherson's history writing, through a post-colonial lens, drawing on the work of two key thinkers in this tradition, Frantz Fanon and Ranajit Guha. Before we examine Macpherson's history writing, let's remind ourselves of who he was and how he's most remembered today as the poet of Ossian fame. So, James Macpherson was born in 1736 in Ruthven, and in preparing this talk over the weekend, I realised that fortuitously we are doing this talk on the eve of his birthday, so happy birthday, Seamus Mann. He was the son of Andrew and Margaret Macpherson, who were from the tacksman class in Badenoch, part of that middling sort in Highland society, so reasonably well off, but some way distant from the social elite of the clan. So James begins his life in a substantial longhouse like this, in an environment similar to that of the township at the Highland Folk Museum in Newton Moor, where this picture is taken. And he ends his days here at Ballerville, the magnificent Robert Adam design mansion which Macpherson had built once he'd made his fortune in life. So how did he do this? Well, the beginning of Macpherson's fame and fortune is, of course, the Tales of Ossian, which make Macpherson pretty much a household name across the UK, Europe, and the Americas. This is what Macpherson is still renowned for today, but that's not even the half of it. Having published the Ossianic collections in the 1760s while he was still only in his 20s, Macpherson then goes on to have a career in colonial service, spending time in Florida and Jamaica, which then gives him a decent government pension. Macpherson uses his government connections to become a pamphlet writer and propagandist for the government, first under the patronage of the Prime Minister Lord Bute, and then later Lord North, just as Edward Gibbon is. Macpherson also makes significant money from working as the UK-based agent for the Nawab of Arcot in India, using his connections not only for his own profit, there are rumours of diamond smuggling and all sorts, but also to place members of Clan Macpherson in positions within the East India Company. And then finally he becomes an MP for Camelford down in Cornwall, which of course he never visits, and he's buried in Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey. However, Macpherson also makes an awful lot of money from being a successful writer. And again, the Ossianic collections are only the beginning of what becomes a highly lucrative career as a writer in many different genres and styles. So Macpherson's writing career begins when he publishes The Highlander in 1758, an epic poem about early medieval Scotland. Then we have the beginnings of the Ossianic collections with the Fragments of Ancient Poetry from 1760, which continue with Fingal in 1761-62, Temera in 1763, and then the collected Ossianic material in the Works of Ossian 1765, and finally the Poems of Ossian in 1773. But Macpherson spends much of the 1770s writing history, from the ancient Celtic past to the history of Macpherson's contemporary world. So in 1771, Macpherson publishes his introduction to the history of Great Britain and Ireland, followed by a translation of Homer's Iliad in 1773. Then in 1775, the double whammy of the papers containing the secret history of Great Britain and the history of Great Britain from the Restoration to the accession of the House of Hanover. Macpherson's career as a government pamphleteer and propagandist culminates in 1776, when he writes the British government's response to the American Revolutionaries' Declaration of Congress. This is Macpherson's The Rights of Britain Asserted Against the Claims of America. Then his final two book publications appear in 1779, his second significant government pamphlet, A Short History of the Opposition During the Last Session, and his defence of his and his fellow clan member Sir John Macpherson's interests in India, the history and management of the East India Company. If we're going to understand Macpherson then as an Enlightenment historian, we need to establish what we mean by this. So what were the key principles of history writing which we now associate with the Enlightenment? The great New Zealand historian J.G.A. Pocock is a useful guide here. In his 6-volume study of Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Pocock spends much of Book 2 discussing how Gibbon builds upon the approach to history writing developed by David Hume in his own 6-volume history, the History of England, published between 1754 and 1762. Pocock argues that there were three key elements to Hume's history writing: narrative, philosophy, and erudition. The narrative elements of Hume's history writing focused on narrating the deeds of individuals, nearly always great men. By philosophy, Pocock means that Hume was not only narrating events, he was also explaining them through a process of analytical reflection that Pocock describes as combining the double key of political narrative and sociological generalization. And finally, erudition, the use of source material and the recording of these in footnotes. Our argument here then is that just as Gibbon was following these principles of Enlightenment history writing that Hume had established, so was Macpherson. And it's no coincidence that both Gibbon and Macpherson are both writing their key works of non-fiction history during the 1770s. It makes total sense for Macpherson to be writing in this way if we consider who his friends were in both Edinburgh and London. Hugh Blair, the minister in the bottom left-hand corner there, the successor to Adam Smith as the Professor of Rhetoric and Belles Lettres at the University of Edinburgh, and a leading Enlightenment theorist of history writing, Blair is one of the most important figures in Macpherson's life. It's Blair who in 1759 takes Macpherson under his wing and introduces him to the Edinburgh literati, leading to the publication of the first of the Ossianic works, the Fragments of Ancient Poetry, in 1760. Macpherson is also friends with Adam Ferguson, top left, having met in Perthshire in the autumn of 1759 while James was working as a private tutor in Balgowan. And Ferguson's stadial interpretation of history, i.e. that the past moves through different stages of teleological progression, ending up with Western civilization, that becomes one of Macpherson's key organising ideas when he then writes history. Then when Macpherson is staying in London during the late 1760s, he becomes friends with Hume in the top right there. And James is a frequent guest at Hume's philosophical and rather boozy soirees. Hume praises Macpherson for the Celtic history, the introduction to the history of Great Britain and Ireland, published in 1771. But later on, Hume's opinion of Macpherson as an historian changes. Hume is very disappointed that the History of England series that he had begun is then passed on to Macpherson. And this is indicative of the mid-1770s revival of the Ossian controversy that centred around Johnson's recent publication of A Journey to the Western Isles of Scotland in 1775. Blair, though, is Macpherson's most important intellectual guide, especially in his insistence that fidelity to source material is an essential quality of an historian. As we shall see shortly, Macpherson is a stickler for using primary source material, both manuscripts and printed, that demonstrate his commitment to writing history in this Enlightenment mode that we've just outlined. First, let's deal with two of Pocock's key pillars of Enlightenment history writing: how to reconcile the narration of past events with the need to explain them. Macpherson's combination of narrative and philosophy in his history writing reaches a peak in his last work, The History and Management of the East India Company, published in 1779. Macpherson turns to the history of empire in order to defend the interests in India of himself and his fellow Macpherson, Sir John of Slate-on-Skye. For extended periods from the late 1760s to the early 1790s, John and James acted as agents for the Nawab of Arcot, Muhammad Ali Khan Walaja, pictured here, the tremendously bearded gentleman at the bottom of the screen, who was one of the most powerful rulers in the Carnatic region of India. By the 1770s, relations between the Nawab and the East India Company had deteriorated dramatically, and the East India Company were seeking to curb the Nawab's power. James Macpherson writes his History and Management of the East India Company in order to defend the Nawab's position and to attack what he perceives as the corrupt authoritarianism of the East India Company. It's absolutely fascinating that in making a political argument in the present, Macpherson feels the need to write history, writing about the past in an authoritative fashion, following the principles of Enlightenment history writing, gives Macpherson legitimacy in the late 1770s. Throughout the East India Company, the history and management of the East India Company, Macpherson moves between narrative and philosophy, between telling us what happened and explaining why things happened, and how the specificities of the past fitted into a broader history of social and cultural change, to use Pocock's phrase. Like other Enlightenment historians, Macpherson combined these kinds of broader reflections with an explicitly narrative approach to the past. For Macpherson, history was a succession of facts, which were then put together by the historian as a narrative. Yet, as Mark Salver Phillips argues in the context of Hume's history writing, this emphasis on narrative was itself philosophical. In his discussion of the early modern Carnatic in chapter 2 of this book, Macpherson pauses to reflect on the importance of arranging facts in a narrative structure, to quote, "Where the great line of facts is ascertained by domestic history, we may safely rely on their fidelity relative to circumstances," end quote. Here, Macpherson stresses the importance of linear narrative in history writing, but with a caveat that the circumstances in which a historian finds these facts is key. But if, to quote again, if we find them without a guide, we are in danger of being led into a region of clouds and darkness. So then for Macpherson, history writing, interpretation is absolutely key. The notion that history writing is a narration of facts is further emphasized in the next chapter of this book, where Macpherson explores early 18th century developments in the Carnatic. Again, Macpherson argues that the causes of broader societal change can only be understood through historical narrative. To quote, To explain the causes of those revolutions which form the foundation of the power and influence of the British nation in Hindustan, we must recur to facts further back in point of time than some of those already related. End quote. Such a narrative relies fundamentally on the skill of the historian in selecting facts and using such evidence as the basis for an interpretation of the past. As Macpherson argues in his introduction to chapter 6 and the discussion there of the period 1769 to 1771, his, to quote, preceding narrative has been succinct, but through such a selective narration of facts, he has, to quote again, comprehended the most material transactions on the coast, end quote. Macpherson summarizes his historiographical approach in the book's final chapter, where he once more reflects on the interrelationship between evidence, narrative, and interpretation. To quote, "The chain of facts, with the arguments which naturally arose from those facts, contained in the preceding pages and founded chiefly on the authority of the papers published by the directors in their own defence, may be thought sufficient to decide the judgment of the public." End quote. Through this process, Macpherson created a concise narrative of transactions, but one based upon the evidence of source material, in this case, the East India Company's own papers, which are then used by Macpherson to generate broader arguments about the nature of the British state and its empire. Such an approach demonstrates how Macpherson's mode of history writing was both narrative and philosophical, engaging with ideas and methodologies that were similar to Hume, Blair, and others. So what does Macpherson base his narrative and analysis upon? Here, Macpherson clearly outlines his methodology in the preface to the History and Management of the East India Company, and tells us about how he bases his argument on the evidence of primary sources. So the Court of East India Directors, having perhaps industriously involved the affairs of the Carnatic in obscurity by their voluminous defence, the author of the following work found himself obliged to deduce his accounts from an earlier period of time. To extricate the subject from difficulty, he has connected the controversial part of the discussion with an authentic and impartial narrative of the most important transactions on the coast of Coromandel. His arguments and reasonings are only such as naturally result from his facts, and his facts are founded upon the most incontrovertible evidence to which the reader is referred at the bottom of every page. So having established this scrupulous methodology, basing an argument on the evidence of sources which he then footnotes, Macpherson then demonstrates the philosophical value of this. So a few paragraphs down in the preface, "The labour and toil which attend the selection of the materials upon which this volume is founded employed a considerable portion of time. The facts and authorities were weighed with the most scrupulous attention to truth and impartial justice. The relation of transactions is supported everywhere by a cloud of witnesses, and where the conduct of the company is most blamed, the foundation of censure is placed on their own records as published by the directors." These are notions then that were central to Hugh Blair's writing of history, especially the idea of an historian's impartiality and their fidelity to the source material. And Macpherson here is deliberately echoing his old mentor's words. And in doing so, Macpherson further demonstrates his credentials as an Enlightenment historian. Now, earlier in the year, I became a little obsessed with one of the key planks of Macpherson's Enlightenment methodology, his use of footnotes mentioned on the very first page of the preface to the History and Management of the East India Company. These footnotes reveal the sources Macpherson draws upon for this history of the East India Company and how he uses them in an argument against the corrupt practices of the company. This helps us to measure one of Macpherson's key criteria, which he outlines in the preface to the book, the extent to which the case against the company can be made from their own papers. Unlike some of his other pieces of history writing, Macpherson is reliant here on predominantly published material, but which very often contain printed versions of archival and manuscript material. So here we have in one of the footnotes an extract from a primary source, which Macpherson then analyzes in the main body of the text. So in over 1,000 footnotes referring to more than 50 different published and unpublished sources, Macpherson is most reliant throughout the book on the work of three key authors: George Rouse, Robert Orme, and Alexander Dux, all of whom worked for the East India Company in a variety of different capacities. As Philip Stern has argued recently, historians have long been reliant on the work of company or East India Office employees in writing about the British Empire in this part of the world, and Macpherson was no different. George Rouse's work features most heavily in Macpherson's East India Company, being referred to almost 400 times in the book's capacious footnotes. Rouse was son of Thomas Rouse, a director of the East India Company, and George himself served as legal counsel to the company from 1781 until his death in the early part of the 19th century. Rouse was also a prolific author, writing over a dozen books about legal affairs and the East India Company. In this book, The History and Management of the East India Company, Macpherson refers in his footnotes to many different volumes of what he terms Rouse's appendix. Of course, bibliographic conventions were a long way from emerging, and Macpherson's footnotes are, shall we say, a little light on detail. As Anthony Grafton states in the context of Gibbon, 18th century footnotes can often be tantalizingly precise and yet frustratingly uninformative to the modern reader. My particular favourite of the authors Macpherson references in his footnotes is the chap featured here, Alexander Dux, another figure with both strong company connections and a highly respected scholar of India. So Dux was born in Perthshire in 1735, and he left behind a dangerous and rather dubious career as a smuggler to become an officer in the East India Company's army. Dux rose rapidly in the army during the 1760s to become a lieutenant colonel, learning Persian along the way and becoming a translator and historian. Dux was the first historian to write about India in English, publishing the first two volumes of his History of Hindustan in 1768 and the third in 1772. It's this work which Macpherson uses in his History and Management of the East India Company in a rare moment of bibliographic clarity, referring to Dow's work, thankfully, by its title and to the different volumes which comprise it, which you can see on the slide here. Dux's work proved useful to Macpherson in the East India Company, not just for his condemnation of the likes of Lord Clive for their actions in India, but for his defence of property rights, which was a key concern of Macpherson in his own version of stadial history, one of those key planks of Enlightenment historical thinking. During this period, at the end of the 1760s, when he began to publish his histories, Dux, rather extraordinarily, was a flatmate in London of another Scot who had both literary talent and an interest in India, our very own James Macpherson. So Macpherson was the vital bridge between Dux's East India career, his Orientalist scholarship, fellow Enlightenment figures, and the literary world of London. So as well as sharing a publisher, Beckett and de Hont in the Strand, and living together during 1768 and 1769, they are also frequent visitors to and correspondents with one of the Enlightenment's leading lights, the great David Hume. So they lived together, they worked together, they shared ideas, and as Jessica Patterson argues in a recent article, Dux's account of Hindu religion was most likely influenced by Macpherson's analysis of Celtic religion and its decline into superstition, which Macpherson explores in the Fragments of Ancient Poetry and in the Celtic History. Dux also works closely with Macpherson's great collaborator on Indian affairs, Sir John Macpherson, who contributes a section to the History of Hindustan. So given this close personal connection, it's no surprise that Macpherson made great use of Dux's work in his book, The History and Management of the East India Company, especially given Dux's defence of the Nawab of Arcot in the History of Hindustan. Indeed, it was perhaps Dux's example of a historian who had a practical impact and influence on contemporary political affairs in India that persuaded Macpherson to write a history in defence of his and Sir John's interest in the Carnatic. Then was a leading Orientalist whose work had a profound influence on Macpherson's book, The History and Management of the East India Company, and demonstrates Macpherson's serious engagement with the broader intellectual culture of the time and its key concern with Orientalism. And these intellectual networks are revealed very excitingly in Macpherson's footnotes. It should also be pointed out that even more extraordinary, Dhu and Macpherson shared a mistress in the late 1760s, who Macpherson almost ends up marrying, but not quite. Famously, Macpherson never marries, but that was as close as he came. So we spent quite a bit of time establishing Macpherson's credentials as an Enlightenment historian who uses primary sources and seeks to create a balance between narrating the past and analysing it, conforming then to Pocock's tripart structure of Enlightenment history writing, of narrative, philosophy, and erudition. Now I'd like to turn our attention to what these writings tell us about Macpherson's relationship with colonialism, and how we can usefully read Macpherson's writing, Macpherson's texts, through a post-colonial lens, drawing on the work of two key thinkers in this tradition, Frantz Fanon on the right and Ranajit Guha on the left. Using Fanon and Guha in this way produces interesting and sometimes quite contradictory results. And this in turn helps to place Macpherson on what we might call a colonial continuum, on which we can slide him according to his particular circumstances and ideas at any one point. What emerges from this reading is a complex image of Macpherson's coloniality. At some junctures, he acknowledges the colonised status that he, as a Gael, and the Highlands as a region had in the mid-18th century. But at others, he writes in a mode of more conventional Enlightenment history writing that privileged the colonising British state over the narratives and stories of the past derived from indigenous Indian culture. So Fanon and aspects of Guha's work help us to interpret Macpherson's use of oral tradition, poetry, and his emphasis on the power of history in identity formation. And on the other hand, elements of Guha's work help us to interpret Macpherson as something of a proto-Hegelian, following the philosophy of George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel at the end of the 18th century, centering the British state at the heart of his history writing. So let's explore some examples of this, how we can use the work of Fanon and Guha to interpret Macpherson's history writing. So in the introduction to the history of Great Britain, Macpherson makes an argument, that knowing your history, knowing where you've come from, gives you and your culture agency and power in the present. One of Macpherson's key aims, after all, in writing this Celtic history, the introduction to the history of Great Britain, was to demonstrate that the region in which much of this history took place, the Highlands, was just as much a part of Britain as the rest of the UK. Indeed, Macpherson's point is stronger still. In calling this book an introduction to the history of Great Britain, Macpherson makes the claim that the whole history of the current UK state has its origins in this Celtic past, and that their contemporary 18th century descendants are, in fact, more British than anyone else, and certainly more so than those perfidious English. In the section on Irish history, which we have in front of us here, Macpherson reflects at length on the key role played by oral tradition in the creation of knowledge about the past. Here he discusses the role of oral transmission in the composition of history and as the way in which the history of early societies is preserved. Macpherson connects oral history with the idea of civilization, echoing the Enlightenment idea of stadial history. Macpherson's focus here, though, is on the role and awareness of one's own history, and crucially, an attempt to record it, plays in the creation of a civilized society. So, to quote Macpherson, the art of perpetuating ideas and of transmitting the wisdom of one age to another is the first means of civilizing mankind out of their natural ferocity and barbarity. So, for Macpherson, history transmission of whatever type is a marker of civilization. And then he goes on. When some certain marks are found to send down the memory of inventions and transactions through a series of generations, a nation becomes polished in proportion to the length of time it has been in possession of that art. So Macpherson's Celtic history was then a history of here, the Highlands, written from the perspective of the region by someone who grew up here and lived much of his later adult life also in the region. In doing so, Macpherson stresses the value of the Highlands oral tradition and how this then lays the basis for a society that was acutely aware of its past, sending down the memory of inventions and transactions through a series of generations, to use that great phrase of Macpherson's. So it's generational transmission of history through the oral tradition that is the basis of culture in the Highlands. Macpherson then links this awareness of the past to the development of the region in the present. A nation becomes polished in proportion to the length of time it has been in possession of that art. In some ways, this can be read as a riposte to those who, during the 18th century, denounced the Highlands as backward and barbarous region. Many key Enlightenment figures, both north and south of the border, saw the region as uncivilized and in need of remedial measures to bring it up to the standards of modernity. The British government, of course, had long seen the Highlands as a region of the UK that was dark and difficult, full of uppity natives who needed to be disciplined in the ways of a polite and commercial society. Yet here, Macpherson is arguing that societies such as the Highlands, where a thriving oral tradition has been transmitting the wisdom of one age to another for centuries, are already civilized. Therefore, attempts to change Highland culture were unnecessary, in Macpherson's view, given the culture and civilization that the region already possessed. So here, Ranajit Guha's analysis of 18th and early 19th century history writing can help us make sense of this. In his book, History at the Limits of World History, this is all about the evolution of a Western way of writing history that focuses, to the exclusion of almost all else, on the history of the state. In making this argument, Guha's bogeyman is the German philosopher Hegel, who argues that a people or a nation lacked history not because it knew no writing, but because, lacking as it did in statehood, it had nothing to write about. So having thoroughly demonstrated how this way of writing history then marginalizes and excludes those who are stateless or on the periphery of states, Guha concludes his book by going back to an older tradition in Indian history writing, one based on poetic writing about the past, and arguing that this emphasis on poetry is one way in which the tyranny of the authoritarian state, the authoritarian and colonizing state, can be resisted and overcome. And to quote Guha, excuse me, understood thus, certain aspects of a long-lost European tradition show up in the light of an unmistakable affinity with the ancient Indian concept of wonder. And he goes on to root this concept of wonder in the oral tradition. To quote again, however, the once told and once heard is never the same when repeated next time. The once again is separated from each previous instance by an irreducible hiatus, which would continue to generate variations, and with them wonder at every retelling. So Macpherson's conception of Highland history, as outlined in the poetry of Ossian and the prose of his history writing, is derived from this world of oral tradition and wonder, this concept of wonder. But of course, in the very process of committing this history to print, of translating the tales of Ossian into literary English, and in employing a mode of Enlightenment history writing, Macpherson moves away from that world of oral tradition and wonder and fixes Highland history in a way that's antithetical to this world of wonder produced in the telling and retelling of stories. So Macpherson then, in both the Ossianic collections and the histories, promotes the value of the Gallic world, while at the same time placing it in the colonizing context of history writing, which is at the service of the British state. In his writing on India, Macpherson again is engaged in a seemingly contradictory process of both challenging and promoting British colonialism. On the one hand, Macpherson doesn't conform to Guha's analysis of how history writing was put to work as an instrument of the East India Company's colonial project, to quote Guha. Macpherson's book, after all, is all about demonstrating the corruption of the East India Company and of promoting the regional interests of the Carnatic and its ruler within that particular sphere of empire. However, in the same way that Macpherson recognised the colonised position of the Gael, this is not done so as a broader critique of colonialism, but instead as a means of asserting the importance of the Nawab of Arcot to the British imperial project. Equally, in Macpherson's response to the declaration of the General Congress in 1776, Macpherson goes into a full-on proto-Hegelian mode of history writing, where he uses the past to justify the increasingly authoritarian nature of British colonial rule in the 13 colonies. Gower's work then it's a useful guide to Macpherson's history writing, helping us to place him on this colonial continuum, where he both challenges the hegemony of colonial modes of knowledge production in asserting the value of Highland history and culture and its basis in the oral tradition, while also advocating for the greater consideration of colonial peripheries, such as the Highlands, such as the Carnatic, in the work itself of empire. My final foray into post-colonial approaches to James Macpherson's history right comes from Frantz Fanon via Jim Hunter. So we've seen how Macpherson was not only a prolific history writer, an Enlightenment historian, no less the equal of Hume, Gibbon, and all the rest, but also that he used his writing to demonstrate how it was possible to write history from a Highland perspective, from the Ossianic collections to the Celtic history, indeed to the history of the East India Company. Macpherson then bears useful comparison to more recent historians of the Highlands and how they have used the region's past to inspire pride in our history, culture, and identity. And here we can turn our attention to the work of our foremost historian of the Highlands, Jim Hunter, pictured here next to Frantz Fanon. Ever since Jim was a student at Aberdeen during the 1960s, where of course Macpherson was also a student, but some time earlier, Jim has thought about the ways in which history writing can empower the region by inspiring communities now to take ownership of the past and use it to change the present. Jim's approach to Highland history was prompted by his engagement with African history while he was an undergraduate. And it was the work of Frantz Fanon, the great French, Caribbean, and African intellectual and revolutionary, who inspired Jim to think about how history could be used as a tool of Highland regeneration. And here in the wee passage I've quoted from one of Jim's articles, we see Jim referring to Fanon's ideas about the need for colonised peoples to reclaim and reinterpret their own past because colonisers have taken it from them. And this is Fanon from The Wretched of the Earth. Colonialism, not satisfied merely with holding a people in its grip, turns the past of the oppressed people and distorts, disfigures and destroys it. The total result looked for is to convince the natives that colonialism came to lighten their darkness. This reminds me a little bit of the work of Hugh Trevor Roper, and it's no accident that he thought that the Highlands and Islands and Africa had no history. And that those of you who follow me on Twitter will recall that I dismissed this as dangerous, pernicious nonsense, and so it is. So Jim then goes to, in this article, Jim then goes on to place Fanon's ideas in a Highland context, using them to interpret the process by which Highland culture had faded. And here he refers to John Murdoch's writing about land reform in the 1880s. Murdoch says, the language and law of the Highlanders being treated with despite has tended to crush their self-respect. When a man is convinced that his language was a barbarism and that the only good thing about him is land, was because of his general worthlessness to go to a man of another race and another tongue, what remained that he should struggle for? But then in this writing, Jim switches from despair to hope. If we as Highlanders reclaim our culture and our past and celebrate it, this will give folks in the here and now pride in themselves and the region, which in turn will underpin the economic, social and cultural regeneration of the Highlands. And this was a position not a million miles away from James Macpherson's arguments in the 1760s and 1770s, that by promoting the rich culture and history of the region, Highlanders could take pride in themselves and fully embrace the benefits of the emerging commercial modernity of the British state. Of course, Macpherson himself was the embodiment of this, someone who used the culture and history of the region to make his name and his fortune, who went out into the world establishing himself as an historian of the highest intellectual caliber, who came back to the Highlands embracing the opportunities of the modern commercial world, together with its unsavoury aspects of improvement and clearance at his estate in Balagon. One final example with which to wrap things up that echoes some of the issues raised by Hunter via Fanon. Here we have an intriguing passage from the opening dissertation to Fingal in 1762 concerning the antiquities of Ossian's poems, where Macpherson makes the argument that Highlanders need to rediscover these stories from their region's past. So Macpherson starts this passage by outlining a number of changes wrought to Highland society in the present day, in the 1760s. So he starts, the genius of the Highlanders has suffered a great change within these few years. The communication with the rest of the island is open, and the introduction of trade and manufactures has destroyed that leisure which was formerly dedicated to hearing and repeating the poems of ancient times. Many have now learned to leave their mountains and seek their fortunes in a milder climate. And though a certain amor patriae may sometimes bring them back, they have, during their absence, imbibed enough of foreign manners to despise the customs of their ancestors. Bards have been long disused, and the spirit of genealogy has greatly subsided. Men begin to be less devoted to their chiefs, and consanguinity is not so much regarded. When property is established, the human mind confines its views to the pleasure it procures. It does not go back to antiquity, or look forward to succeeding ages. The cares of life increase, and the actions of other times no longer amuse. Hence it is that the taste for their ancient poetry is at a low ebb among the Highlanders. So, according to this analysis from Macpherson, that the contemporary Highlands had abandoned poetry in order to pursue the modernity of commerce and empire and all the rest. Therefore, according to Macpherson, it was necessary to make the poetry of the Highlands a part of this desirable modernity in order to revive the region's culture. So Macpherson's translations of the Ossianic tales made this a literally fashionable thing to do. And in reading Macpherson's interpretation of the region's past, Highlanders could embrace the modernity of the present, demonstrating how the culture and history of the Gaeltacht was just as valid and important in shaping the modern world of the late 18th century as the culture of others. So for Macpherson, the tales of Fingal, Ossian, and all the rest were not the poetry of a dead and dying race. It's a story of their past, which continued to have value and importance in the present. To conclude then, I hope we've established a number of things about James Macpherson and his history writing. First, that we need to take Macpherson seriously as an Enlightenment historian in his reflections on how to narrate the past while analysing it. Macpherson engages in the debates and processes that had been pioneered by Hume in the mid-18th century and were then later taken forward by the likes of Blair, Gibbon, and William Robertson. Macpherson is part of this world, and the way in which he writes about the past reflects this. Second, that Macpherson's engagement with sources and use of footnotes demonstrates that from a methodological point of view, his history writing was at the cutting edge of historiographical practice during the 1770s. And finally, that reading Macpherson through the lens of post-colonial writers such as Fanon and Goua helps us to make sense of Macpherson's position in the British colonial and imperial world. By emphasising the value of Highland culture and history in a way recognisable to Fanon, Macpherson makes the case not for the overthrow of the British state, but instead for the greater incorporation of the region and its people in the work of empire. Equally, his commitment to taking oral culture seriously, which wasn't an approach generally shared by his fellow Enlightenment historians, and seeing oral culture as the basis for history writing, this places Macpherson out with the kinds of mainstream history analysed by Goua that emphasise the rise of the Western state. But at the same time, his writing, Macpherson's writing on India, sought to promote the interests of the Carnatic within empire and not opposed to it. So once again, Macpherson takes elements of the past to critique the British colonial project while at the same time validating these other aspects of British imperialism. Macpherson then was an Enlightenment historian, but this is a mode of history writing that was intimately connected to the European imperial project of colonizing other parts of the world. And Macpherson was at the heart of this, though often in complex and contradictory ways. Thank you very much.
Jim, thank you very much indeed. Little clap from me. That was really, really excellent indeed, and most enlightening, if you'll forgive the almost deliberate pun there. No, okay, fine. Yes, so very interesting. You say that Macpherson was at the cutting edge of historiographical writing in his own period. Well, I'm sure everybody will agree with me that that's what we've just heard was at the cutting edge of historiographical writing for this period. So thank you very much indeed. I'm sure that there are a large number of questions. We have a wee bit of time to take them. So without further ado, if that's all right with you, Jim, once you've refreshed yourself, we'll open it up to the floor. People just jump in, and if we get like lots of people trying to jump in, we'll try and manage it the best we can. Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much, George. I have a question to start us off. I'm interested in, was it Gua's theories about the oral resisting state because it changes every time? But with Gua at all, so I was wondering that's the reference again, and even how to spell his name. So very, very simple question, but I was like, oh, I wonder idea how to spell it or what it or where to.
Cool, fantastic. Thanks, Anna. That's a great question. Yeah, Ranajit Guha. Guha is spelled Guha, and the book that I referred to is called The Limits of World History. And world history is one of these core concepts at the heart of Hegel's thought, that you can only consider yourself to be world historical if you have a state, that the state is the foundation of history itself, not just history writing, but the very notion of having a past is encapsulated in the form of the state, according to Hegel. And Guha, rightly points out that this is dangerous nonsense. This then puts history to work as part of a colonizing project, and it's denying a past and the possibility of writing history to those who are out with this project of the Western colonizing state. So yeah, the limit of world history. History at the Limit of World History, to give the book its full title. It's published in the early 2000s by the University of Chicago Press. It's based on lectures that Guha did in the 1990s. But Guha is an amazing guy. I've only recently come across him. I've been reading Fanon and Said and others for years, but Guha is a new one to me. But Guha is incredibly important. He's at the heart, in fact, one of the founders of the Subaltern Studies project, which he begins when he's working at the University of Sussex in the late 70s. And he's all about taking certain elements of Marxist historical writing and thinking about the colonial situation and how so often that is about the rise of the state and how we need to resist that in some way. So Guha is great. It's quite complex, dense stuff, but it's worth persevering with. So if you can get hold of it, Anna, I'd suggest having a read of some Guha. He's great.
I should just say that if people don't want to ask a question directly, there is a chat function and hidden under messages that you can use as well, and Alice and I will monitor those. But I'll pass the floor over to whoever wants to ask the next question.
Jim, hi, it's Angus. I was just wondering, I can see why once he'd found him, Macpherson was attractive to the Nawab of Arcot, but how did he find him?
Thank you, Angus. That's a great question. It's largely through Sir John. So John is at the cutting edge of Highland involvement in the East India Company during the 1760s and 1770s, and I think it's a great demonstration of how clan-like networks are still functioning in this period. It's many decades post Culloden, but the clan are still looking after their own. James Macpherson encounters Sir John originally during the Highland tour that James undertakes in compiling material for converting the fragments of ancient poetry into the Ossianic collections. So he goes to Skye to collect more of these Ossianic tales, and as you do, you go see the minister. So at Slate, he goes to see the minister there, who is himself a great Gaelic scholar. Meets his son John, and they become great friends from that moment onwards. So it's a great example of how these clan-like networks function, and indeed how James then continues to use similar types of networks to promote Macpherson's into positions with the East India Company. It really is quite extraordinary how many Macphersons from Badenoch then go out east.
If no one else has any questions, I would, I wonder if you could say 1 or 2 words about the forthcoming book, what we can expect.
Thank you, Celia. I'm not one for self-promotion, but as you've asked, so the book it's based on the inspiration, of course, for it comes from Mari's wonderful work on this, her PhD thesis. From I think Mari, you were saying earlier that you were writing the chapter on Macpherson's history writing for the thesis 10 years ago now. Is that? Yeah. And so it's based on that element of Mari's PhD. And in the past couple of years, I've been taking that forward, and so it's looking at all of his history writing from the Ossianic collections onwards, and in each of those, it's trying to establish, Macpherson is writing in an Enlightenment mode of history writing. So there's a lot of detailed discussion about methodology and why things like footnotes matter. As we've seen from the footnotes there, they reveal intellectual networks. They're incredible things. And it's during this era that we start to see historians using footnotes to reference sources in a methodical way that we would now recognize. And Macpherson's at the heart of it. He is writing, this is good stuff. As Mari will confirm, we're not trying to say that we should put him on a pedestal above, the likes of Edward Gibbon and all that. Just that, he is in that intellectual milieu. He's writing in the same kind of way. He knows the same kinds of people. He's friends with them. He's intellectual colleagues. So it's an examination of those texts. It's quite literary in its focus, but it's placing it within the context of the evolution of history writing, and that Macpherson is a historian, and we need to recognize that. We become, as scholars of Macpherson, it's all about the Ossianic controversy, and frankly, that's really boring. But that should have been put to bed decades ago, but hasn't, for various reasons. And I think a lot of that is to do with the continuing sort of denigration of Highland culture. How on earth could someone like James Macpherson have, compiled this amazing thing? And indeed, how on earth could someone like Macpherson, from his background, be an Enlightenment historian? So a crucial part of this book is demonstrating that someone like Macpherson is part of this culture and is functioning as an intellectual, and we need to recognise that.
Hey, hello, Jim. This is Jim Hunter, and since you're unlikely to get thanks from James Macpherson tonight, I feel I should thank you for your mentions of myself. It'll be just over 50 years ago now since I first read Fanon as a student, as you said, in Aberdeen. And the minute I read that, I just thought, this is the Highlands. This is what the Highlands confront. This is why we need to, as it were, take not just interest, but a degree of pride, well, that's legitimate in a past that's constantly being denigrated, but actually shouldn't be denigrated. And that, as you said, has always been part of my thinking in relation to Highland development that I've also been involved in, that history and heritage in its wider sense are part of that process. So I don't want to ask a question. I just want to say thank you for acknowledging that and building on it in ways that are much, much more ambitious than any that I looked to do. So thank you again. I really enjoyed that. Not, I should stress, not just because you mentioned me. Thank you.
But thank you very much. And in the absence of you asking a question, I'm going to ask you a question, if that's all right. How on earth did you come across Fanon? Was it part of the curriculum at Aberdeen, or did you just randomly come across The Wretched of the Earth?
No, Aberdeen at that time, well, the professor of history was John Hargreaves, and John Hargreaves was one of the pioneers of African history. And one of his close colleagues who died not very long ago, Roy Bridges, was also there, and Roy equally. And both John and Roy had taught in African colleges or universities. And they were at the forefront of the notion that African history, which insofar as it had previously been written, had been written entirely, to go back to some of your own categories, entirely from the perspective of the colonial powers and the bringing of civilization as they saw it to this benighted land. And John, I think it's a long time ago now, but certainly John mentioned, not just mentioned, but made quite a bit of Fanon and suggested that we should read Fanon. And certainly I did that, and I'm sure others did also. And of course, it was at that time that the late, and by me anyway, unlamented Lord Baker, as he afterwards became, in fact, it used to be set sometimes, I think, as an exam question in African history in Aberdeen at that time, because Dacre said, you know, all the African history prior to the arrival of the white man, as he put it, was simply the meaningless gyrations of obscure tribes, and that there was just darkness, and therefore there was no history. And of course, as you yourself just said, it was so easy to recognize in that an approach perhaps somewhat less aggressive, but nevertheless there very strongly in the way that the Highlands were being presented, and even in relation to what I was then interested in, which was the history of the Highlands in the 19th century and the land struggle and all of that. It was very, very striking, or it certainly seemed striking to me, that most academic history, insofar as it at that point was grappling with these issues at all, was doing so entirely from the perspective of estate managements and the like. And that seemed to me to be very similar to the notion that you wrote African history entirely out of the perspective and the records of the colonial powers. And that to that extent, writing history out of estate records in a somewhat extreme moment. At one point, I think I said or wrote somewhere that all that sort of history was just the view from the factor's window and was worth nothing. But I wouldn't go quite that far today. I've grown more moderate in my declining years. But it was all of these things seem to me to hang together. And as I've said on more than one occasion, I actually felt, in my case anyway, I learned more about Highland history, and certainly about how to write Highland history, from studying African history than I learned from courses in British history. So I think that'll do from me. So thank you again.
That's fabulous. Thank you. Yeah, I wonder who else in British, which other undergraduates in the 1960s in British universities were reading Fanon. That is quite something. And we're then using it, you know, within, you know, not that long, you're using it to underpin, you know, researching and writing some serious historical scholarship. So yeah, I think that's incredible that you and other folks at Aberdeen are at the forefront of that. That's a wonderful story. Thank you, Jim.
If I could ask Jim a question, Norman Newton here. Jim, what do we know about what his contemporaries thought of his historical writings? Have you any examples of book reviews or anything like that?
Well, we don't have a huge amount. So, for example, with the History of Great Britain published in 1775, we have a few notices. But despite Macpherson being advanced £3,000 to write this, which was an awful lot of money in the mid 1770s, it just sort of doesn't really. The reception is muted, shall we say? So it's quite interesting that I think some of the issues that we have now about our inability to see the full extent of Macpherson's writings and his writings as an historian were applying then. That 1775, it's the Ossianic controversy is rearing its head again, and that sort of steamrolls everything in front of it. Of course, if one was cynical, you might say that Macpherson's emphasis on sources and fidelity and truth and all the rest come at least partly from an attempt to derail those kinds of critiques. That he's saying that that all this stuff around the Ossianic controversy, this absolutely doesn't apply. It doesn't apply to the poetry. It certainly doesn't apply to the history writing. So yeah, that there is some critical reflection, and some of it, it is appreciative. Hume's initial reaction in 1771 to the publication of the Introduction to History of Great Britain, Hume praises it greatly, especially because it's using in this Celtic history. Macpherson makes great use of classical historians, Tacitus and all the rest. So Hume loves that. Hume loves the fact that he's writing in that classical mode of history writing. But then once Macpherson gets onto the more modern stuff, and once he's publishing in the second flowering of the Ossianic controversy, then Hume changes his mind. So yeah, it's interesting that there is not that much critical response. It's there, but it's not as much as we might expect. And of course, as we have today, it focuses on issues pertaining to the Ossianic controversy.
Jim,
Do we know anything about print runs? How many copies of the books were published?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm wondering, Mari, do you know what kind of print run we're talking about here?
Hi, sorry. I have no idea. It's a really good question. It's something I tried to find out more about when I was working on this when I was doing my PhD, and I never got anywhere with it because records weren't very carefully kept. I was thinking, Norman, about your question about reception and stuff. I'm wondering how much reception stuff we'd find in kind of the Scots magazine. There wasn't much, and how much would have been in letters and in conversations over the dinner table. How much where does that kind of stuff now lives on Twitter and things like that, and their version of that I think would have been that, and that's a really hard thing to find out more about, particularly when people are using nicknames and things like that. And so yeah, no, I want to find out more, but I never got anywhere with it.
I'm just thinking that Paul Di in the States has done some excellent work on Macpherson's letters. And I think he is in the process of writing a book based on the letters that hopefully might reveal more. But I fear that won't appear until we publish this one. So we'll have to wait for later.
Jim, I was just wondering about if one thing that makes Macpherson stand out is language. Obviously, he's a Gaelic speaker and he's a scholar of Gaelic, but more broadly, and you mentioned Dhu in his translation work, but there's a long line of Highland writers going back centuries by that point who stand out because they're very talented and capable and open and used to dealing with multiple languages.
Oh, that's a fascinating question. And of course, places Macpherson in the same kind of multilingual European focus milieu as a certain James Fraser of of Kirkhill. Yeah,
of course,
yeah, absolutely. That's an absolutely fascinating question. Not one that I've really thought about, but it's, for example, it's what gives him access to the Scots College in Paris to look at various Stuart papers that are there in the 1770s. So he has this European focus that facilitates his historical research, and has languages. There's the great story about how the wee little school in Ruthven, he learns Hebrew. Just mind-boggling. Can you imagine learning Hebrew in Ruthven? It's quite a leap, isn't it? But yeah, he is like many of children of that class in that period is learning Greek, Latin, Hebrew, multiple European languages. Yeah, absolutely. So I think that the world that you're exploring with James Fraser from the earlier period, absolutely, Macpherson is part of that European-focused milieu that is so comfortable with different languages, and that's what enables him to write the history that he does. That he can get access to that material in other languages.
Hi, Jim. It's Mackie here. How are you?
Very well. Thanks for coming, Mackie. Good to see you.
No, smashing. Absolute revelation for my good self here. I've got a question that relates to how you think Macpherson's writings, his approach, his understandings fit. You made a very convincing case in terms of where he sits on sort of ideas of the new nation state and empire. But I suppose my question is, okay, there's Hegel, there's Gibbon. What do you think he thinks about nation and that tricky concept in between empire and state? He uses it in interesting ways, and I'm wondering where you think on your spectrum the Highland nation or the Arcot nation sit in his sort of panoply of both sort of societal development and, interestingly, history writing. Thanks.
That's a wonderful question. Thank you very much, Mackie. It puts me in mind of Ian McKinnon's fascinating talk at the Gallic Society of Inverness a few weeks back, where he's talking about later 19th century folk like Charles Fraser Mackintosh, like Cluny Macpherson, and how they are playing with ideas of the Gallic nation and Gaeldom as some sort of ethnic category. But they're doing so very firmly within the British state and within British imperialism, and it reminds me as well. Seeing Celia there on the screen. Celia did some wonderful research on Alexander McEwen, Provost of Inverness during the 1930s and the first leader of the SNP, and how he was promoting Scottish independence, but within that sort of almost a Highland nation idea. But Scottish independence within the British Empire, placing it on a parallel with the likes of Canada and all the rest. I think Macpherson is playing with some of those ideas, but of course he's a profoundly loyal servant of the British state, not least because it's giving him lots of money. it's fueling and funding his extravagant lifestyle and enabling him to build something like Balliville. So in terms of his connection with nation, I think he's someone who sees a certain utility to claiming a British identity at certain points. At others, there's greater utility in emphasising the Highland Gallicness, but within the empire. It puts me in mind of one final thing. In Mari's PhD thesis, she did a brilliant critical edition of Macpherson's first published work, The Highlander, from 1758. Where Macpherson, it's this preposterous tale of seeing off the Danes in the whatever century, 10th century, something like that. And one of the lines that Macpherson uses is "see Scots and Saxons coalesced as one." Putting together the Scottish and the Anglo-Saxon in very stark unity, that is what underpins. And of course, his tale of the 10th century is a parallel. It's a parable of the rise of the British state, and he's seeing utility in uniting those things. So I'm not sure if that does answer your question, Mackie. I suppose it's the short answer is yes, but only in certain contexts, and it changes over time.
Many thanks, Jim.
So we've had some really fascinating questions there and some really fascinating discussion. Thank you very much to everybody. I have no desire to keep you all hanging on very much longer. There is chance for one last quick question if anybody has one. Otherwise, we'll wrap up. But one last quick question if anybody has anything. That always, of course, puts the mockers on it, doesn't it? Really. But time is creeping on, so we'll end it there, Jim. Thank you very much once again for such a fantastic talk and at such great depth. So thank you very much. Before I say goodbye to everybody else, I just want to remind people that our next History Lives talk will be at 5:30. But this time on Thursday, the 19th of November. And that talk will be by our colleague Nicola Martin, and it's on Lord Loudon and the transatlantic impact of military strategy and imperial policy making. So a little bit more of the imperialism theme, which seems to be writ large nowadays. So without further ado, thank you very much, everybody. Thank you very much for your attendance, and thank you very much, Jim, once again, and good night to everybody.
Jim.
Cheers. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a good evening. Bye for now.
Jim, good night.